The greatest monster of all is man. The daemon does not choose to dwell outside the blessed Imperium, nor does the Xenos cast aside the holy form of man to walk another path. Both are terrible and foul, it is true. But the heretic and the traitor were given every gift in the universe, and chose to cast them aside. There is no greater crime than this.
A chaos cult is the most dangerous of all those organizations that plot to overthrow the rule of the Imperium of man from within. All planets and civilizations belonging to the Imperium can harbor chaos-tainted organizations, which themselves are as diverse in practice and membership as is imaginable. From the blood-soaked sacrificial cults of feral worlds to the philosophical secret societies of more advanced planets, the temptations of chaos can capture all. The objective of the chaos cult is to survive and eventually dominate the society in which it dwells. Mere survival is particularly important on imperial worlds, where chaos worship is the greatest of heresies, and inquisitors are always vigilant and ready to wipe out any taint of chaos. Generally clandestine in nature, as discovery could bring with it attention from the local Adeptus Arbites contingent all the way up to the Inquisition, cults often hide behind the front of some form of legitimate imperial organization in their attempt to accumulate local or planetary power, such as trade unions, charitable organizations, accepted religious groups, and even local variants of the imperial cult. Extreme political parties make good fronts for cults, as they naturally attract power-hungry and mentally unbalanced individuals who make particularly good material for potential cult members. A very successful organization can achieve real political power, even gaining enough strength to make it possible for the cult to become the governing body of the planet without having to resort to outright rebellion. After taking root, and as it expands in power and influence, eventually, a chaos cult may end up effectively ruling anything from a township to the entire planet. Eventually, an uprising breaks out, either purposefully or because the cult has grown too large and/or unruly to remain secret any longer. At this point, the cult can be expected to summon aid from their chaos masters, ranging from demonic possessions of cult members to the outright summoning of members of the traitor legions through the warp to the planet. Cults may also unleash an uprising in concert with a pre-planned invasion of Chaos Space Marines. The ultimate aim of the cult's uprising is to overthrow the imperial planetary government and attain direct control over the world. After the conflict, cultists are often taken back into the Eye of Terror, where they either join the damned population of a demon world or are recruited, sometimes forcibly, into a Chaos Champion's armed forces or as auxiliaries to his warband. The origins of new Chaos Cultists are legion. The teeming masses of the Imperium have colonized the galaxy from end to end. Trillions of souls labor night and day in an increasingly hostile universe. Kilometers-high hive cities boil with overpopulation, dense hab complexes sprawl across continents, and industrial worlds grind and churn by the efforts of uncounted workers under the steely gaze of their high-handed overlords. But the adepts of the established order cannot be everywhere at once. A regime as restrictive and oppressive as the Imperium provides fertile ground for insurrection, and there are those that would foster this discontent for their own black ends. Rebellion festers in the foetid underbelly of almost every civilized imperial world, a fire just waiting for a spark. Where the flames of heresy are given fuel, chaos is quick to follow, turning desperate men into worshippers of the dark gods, and the easy path to power and wealth they promise. The cultists of chaos can be found in one form or another almost anywhere the Imperium has spread. At first glance, they are indistinguishable from normal men and women, but under their clothes, their flesh is tattooed and branded with sigils that hurt the eyes of any faithful who look upon them. When the heretic Astartes come to a planet, the true colors of the cultists are revealed. The powers of darkness are ever quick to promise glory, and even the lowliest initiate knows that to fight alongside such legendary transhuman warriors is to court the gaze of the gods. Improvised armor is donned, and long-hidden weapons are broken out as the cultists prepare to overthrow the Imperium one hab block at a time. Ragtag companies band together under the demagogues that arrive in their midst, for the everyday life of an Imperial citizen is usually so hopeless that even the hint of a new order can be intoxicating. When open war breaks out, screaming gangs of cultists rush into battle, armed with primitive solid-shot weapons, the largest of their number toting heavy stubbers and industrial flamers. Despite their primitive war gear, Chaos cultists are often able to drown a superior foe through sheer weight of numbers and a fierce desire to tear open the belly of the Imperium. As the witch-hunting Ordo Hereticus is always keen to point out, Chaos cultists can come from almost any background. Psychotic soldiers, cutthroat hive-gangers, decadent nobles, Astra Militarum deserters, persecuted abhumans, and sewer-dwelling mutants all turn to the service of Chaos in order to improve their lot. After all, even a man who has nothing left can still barter away his soul. The mutational gifts received by the most powerful cultists can be just as strange as those granted to their Chaos Space Marine masters. A favored devotee might have muscles of living steel, flailing sucker tentacles in place of a tongue, or the horned head of a mindless beast. Regardless of their station, each of these dangerous malcontents trains their mind and body for the day when the favored of the gods will lead them to a darkly glorious future, when they can rise up against the hated order of the Imperium and set the galaxy aflame.
There are no lies in the abyss, for all that man calls lies are its truths, and all that is neither true nor untrue rejoices therein.
When the Age of Darkness, inaugurated by the Horus Heresy, descended upon the Imperium of Man, the galaxy reeled in shock that the Emperor's greatest champions, the Primarchs and their Astartes sons, would seek to tear down all they had built during the Great Crusade. The Legiones Astartes were created to be the very best of mankind, the champions and protectors of an entire species, the stalwart defenders against the unnameable horrors that had brought humanity to the brink of destruction during the bleak millennia of Old Night. If near demigods such as Horus, Fulgrim, or Lorgar could be corrupted under the baleful influence of the powers of the warp, then what hope remained that the teeming populations of mortal humanity would do otherwise? As the Horus Heresy entered its second year and the fires of war swept across the Imperium, the true and horrific extent of the traitor's sins were exposed. The earliest battles had revealed the War Master Horus to have turned numerous august bodies to his cause, including those within the Mechanicum Tagmata and the Legio Titanicus, as well as uncounted Exertus Imperialis Auxilia units. At Calth, however, a new element of the traitor's blasphemy was employed. Vast hosts of mortals sworn to serve the traitor Legiones Astartes, devoted to them not only in body, but in soul. These were deluded warp cultists, so named because of their mindless veneration of the creatures that dwell in the Imperium and of their fallen Legiones Astartes masters. Warp cults had of course been encountered, albeit infrequently, during the progress of the Great Crusade. Such debased examples of humanity were usually found on worlds within proximity of existing warp storm activity, or with a prevalence of psyker birth within the general population. Such cults were oftentimes tainted with interaction with Xenos lore, or contamination by alien species, or promulgated by some alpha-level rogue psyker with messianic or apocalyptic pretensions. Direct confrontations with such threats were, however, rare, as they were either a relatively minor factor in a larger Imperial compliance campaign or encountered in highly unusual circumstances, such as the lengthy persecution of the void-born Gathora warp witches by the Night Lord's Legion across the Valmir reaches in the late 970 SM30. The principal reason for this was that since the very beginning of the Great Crusade, any world encountered with substantial warp breaches in evidence of the kind that such cults either promulgated or were often spawned from were simply destroyed via exterminatus from orbit without direct confrontation. This order had been a direct and unwavering dictate issued directly by the Emperor and one that had been upheld almost without exception until the word-bearers themselves began to covertly subvert and ignore it for their own ends. As to the truth of such veneration, it was considered no more than just another false religion, meaningless in the context of the imperial truth, and consigned to the darkness from which the Great Crusade was delivering the galaxy, or so it was believed. The truth, however, was that on many fringe and backwater worlds declared compliant by Horus's supporters, entire populations had not just been allowed to shed the mask of civilization and reason and surrender themselves to the warp, but actively encouraged to do so by the work of the word-bearers and other, far more hidden forces. As the insanity of galactic civil war gripped the Imperium during the Horus Heresy, previously law-abiding peoples rose up against their masters, slaughtering those in authority in bloody displays of long-repressed hatred. Once productive workers smashed the machines they had tended for generations and set Manufactoria to the torch, whilst amongst the madness-educated men and women cast off the secular reason they had been born into and resurrected the heathen idolatries of their ancestors. Of the seeds of this galaxy-wide chaos, much has been surmised, but very little proven. Indeed, it is likely the warp cults that originally aligned themselves to the War Master Horus's cause did so for a wide range of different reasons, although the end result was essentially the same: anarchy, bloodshed, and treachery on a galactic scale. Regardless of the underlying source of the taint, it was the dark genius of the War Master's numerous envoys, in particular the Word-Bearers' dark apostles and their disciples, that harnessed it to the traitor's cause. No doubt most would have receded over the generations were it not for the far-reaching and horrific scheme of First Chaplain Erebus and his kin, while others would likely have burned themselves out in brief, if bloody, rebellions. One source of the chaos corruption which led to the formation of many warp cults was the religiosity of many ancestor populations, suggesting woeful failure in the imperial iterators, whose task it was to dispel these beliefs and replace them with the imperial truth. Indeed, no world should have been declared fully compliant until this had occurred, hinting at either conspiracy on a monumental scale or gross systemic incompetence. The latter might seem the more plausible theory, but the events of the Horus Heresy indicate the former is all too possible. Regardless, in the aftermath of the Istvan V betrayal, countless thousands of formerly denounced religions reawakened in subtly altered form. Benevolent deities were supplanted by vengeful gods, and offerings of crops replaced with demands for blood sacrifice. All led inexorably to the worship of those ruinous powers which came so close to laying the Imperium low. Another source lay in mankind's own dark nature. Despite the trappings of civilization and the appointment of imperial commanders to rule over them, the populations of a great many human-settled worlds still existed in barbarous conditions, little improved since the Age of Strife. A campaign to bring a primitive feral world such as Oron or Forman C2 to imperial compliance might be won in solar weeks, but it might take solar decades or standard centuries before such a world could support a functional society able to take its place within the Imperium. The populations of these worlds were notoriously warlike and primitive, and it took many generations to educate them in the imperial truth, for native ancestral superstitions were never far from the surface of those recently illuminated by the Emperor's light. Similarly, large parts of the populations of many hive worlds were violently lawless and resentful of any form of authority. Even the most productive of hive worlds were host to countless thousands of wretches who existed in the lightless underhive depths without ever learning of the imperial truth. On worlds such as Gamahorgan, Cato, and Avalorn, hyper-violent underhive gangers were quick to join with the forces of disorder when the Horus Heresy came to their world, hailing Horus as a leader truly deserving of their loyalty. At the other end of the spectrum were highly ranked individuals whose positions within the upper echelons of the imperial expeditionary fleets granted them access to knowledge others were denied. Though many aberrant human cultures were entirely obliterated, conservators attached to the Great Crusade's fleets strove to record tales of the defeated foes of mankind, from ravening alien horrors to recalcitrant human societies. Much of this knowledge was locked securely away and remained accessible only to the most senior of human and transhuman leaders, for many accounts contradicted the atheistic doctrines of the imperial truth and could not be allowed to fall into the hands of the weak or the ignorant. Inevitably, however, some did, and many senior conservators were compromised by the events they recounted or the accounts in their custody. Men and women who had dedicated their entire lives to proving primitive superstitions, false discovered that their own beliefs in empiricism and rationality were in fact founded upon lies. When the age of darkness fell upon the galaxy, the knowledge watched over by many conservators escaped into the hands of madmen and traitors who preached it to the warp-slaved multitudes. The events that unfolded at the Battle of Calth would reveal a far more concerted effort to cultivate false religiosity in direct contradiction of the imperial truth in preparation for the galaxy-wide uprising that erupted in the aftermath of the events on Istvan V. It would be many standard years until the horrifying extent was realized, but it is now evident that the Yeezus 70th Legion, the word bearers, deliberately seeded countless hidden warp cults across the worlds they had brought to compliance in the 5 solar decades prior to the outbreak of the Horus Heresy. These were referred to the Sons of Lorgar, and by many of the cults themselves as the Holy Worlds, and beneath the mask of imperial compliance, they hid a myriad of aberrant doctrines. Worlds that on the surface appeared ordered and civilized, in fact seethed with heresy just below the surface. Furthermore, they attracted the outcast and the dispossessed, those unable or unwilling to accept the imperial truth. Individually or in small groups, hidden chaos pilgrims traveled from all over the Imperium to join these bodies, swelling their numbers to such an extent that when word was given, countless billions rose up as one and declared the War Master Horus as their lord, and in some cases, their god. At the time of the Battle of Calth in the early 31st millennium, few amongst the Imperium's rulers were conscious of what the numerous warp cults actually believed. Later, they would become all too aware, and later still, all such knowledge would be suppressed and declared anathema by the High Lords of Terra and the Inquisition. At that early stage, it was guessed that the cults worshipped what they imagined to be deities within the otherworldly dimension of the warp. Certainly, navigators and astropaths, and perhaps the Primarchs, were aware that the Imperium was host to an order of life that had no analog in the material universe, but which was able to interact in a limited fashion with it, in particular through those who had been born with psychic abilities, ranging from enslavers to psychnuine. Investigations, interrogations, and signals intercepts revealed myriad occult terms in use amongst the warp cults, much of it beyond classification, but there remained certain terms and precepts that appeared over and again. The Primordial Annihilator was one such term, a title determined to refer to the warp itself, as if the Imperium were some vast gestalt consciousness which the warp cults appeared to venerate. Others referred to the Octid and the Eightfold Path, ascribing an unfathomable formulae and a dark purpose to those entities they believed guided their actions. The traitor Legiones Astartes made increasingly extensive use of allied human warp cults as the wars of the Horus Heresy progressed. In many cases, the cultists were found easier to raise and frankly more disposable than conventional imperial military units, for while they were nowhere near as well trained or equipped, they were often so utterly devoted to their corrupted transhuman masters they would obey any order and perform any deed, no matter how callous, inhumane, or suicidal it was. The Sons of Horus Legion, for example, used warp cults as occupation units during the War Master Horus's later phases of the so-called Dark Compliance, for they brought such oppression to captured worlds that few would dare rise up against them. Cultists made effective hunter-killer squads, adept at tracking down every last vestige of loyalist activity on traitor-held worlds and making grisly examples of those they captured. Cult forces also served as brutal overseers of enslaved populations, driving the output of industrialized worlds to many times previous levels to meet ever more strident demands for arms and equipment to fuel the traitors' advance on Terra. Where the Sons of Horus used cult forces to control dominated worlds, the Third Legion, as it slid into its own moral abyss, used such allied forces as disposable sycophants and slavish worshippers, debased beings who view the Emperor's children as the very apex of creation, and for whom no indignity, crime, or sacrifice was too great to perform in the hope of favor. Mortal servants of the Third Legion abased themselves before their masters and would offer their lives in return for the briefest acknowledgement of their very existence. With a single word, any Emperor's Children legionary could order 100 allied cultists to attempt the most lethal of tasks or suicidal of battlefield missions, orders the cultists would obey unquestioningly with rapturous fervor. The heretic Astartes themselves regarded the cultists with contempt, barely noting their presence except where dictated by necessity. In several traitor legions, the ranks of humanity that constituted their support echelons, legion serfs, void crews, menials, and auxiliary troops, were slowly transformed into cult-like bodies. As the Horus Heresy ground on and the traitor legions began to cast off the trappings of their imperial founding, their servants too were transformed into something else entirely. Many of the warp cultists came to idolize their transhuman masters as demigods, entire sects springing into being aboard the traitor fleets. Many were a continuation of the warrior lodges seated in the traitor legions before the Horus Heresy even began, while others were spontaneous expressions of recidivistic superstition entirely beneath the notice of the traitor marines themselves. Soon enough, all had called upon and were enthralled to warp-born entities that cared only to feed upon their bodies and their souls. Not all traitor legions, it must be said, had much use or regard for allied warp cults, seeing them as debased, dangerous, and beneath them, at least before the Age of the Scouring, when many were forced to turn at last to the dark forces themselves to survive. One noted example of this disregard was in the Iron Warriors Legion, who, in a manner entirely in keeping with the nature of their primarch and temperament, used hordes of cultists under their control as expendable levies, utterly scorning their faith, and viewing them of less use than even enslaved local defense militia, which could at least be counted upon to hold a weapon correctly. Notably, if such cult forces came under Perturabo's control, his standing orders provided for the culling of any potent psyker or warp crafter able to raise such warp entities as might interfere with the Iron Warrior's authority, while thousands of the cult's members were driven across minefields or onto the enemy's guns. Those who reached the walls forming a ramp of the dead and dying over which the Iron Warriors would launch the final escalade assault. Sometimes, cult forces tens of thousands strong were herded towards an enemy city or fortress simply so that Iron Warriors' warsmiths could survey the foe's fortifications and map their fire plans without expending their own forces, both legion and mortal military auxilia they deemed of greater value. To the Night Lords, it seems that such warp cults were often no more than trivialities, pawns in the War Master's game and the distrusted lickspittles of the Word-Bearers, with whom they were nominally allied but scorned and distrusted. The Night Lord's mortal auxilia and servants had no master but them, even the whispers of the warp failing to entice them, and no rule but for the fear the Night Lords engendered. This paranoia and obsessive control was even more evident in the machinations of the Alpha Legion, whose own web of agents and armies were labyrinthine and unknowable, and what use they made of warp cults in this era, and at what remove, cannot now be determined. Of all the traitor legions, however, it was the Word-Bearers that made the greatest use of allied warp cult groups, and it was at Calth where they were first openly employed. Although the Word-Bearers often employed the many warp cult forces aligned to them as auxiliary soldiery, their greater worth was as a mass offering to the warp entities to which they were dedicated. In the aftermath of the Istvan Fee Drop Site massacre, the War Master Horus had tasked Lorgar and his brother Primarch Angron with engaging the Ultramarines on the eastern fringe and ensuring that the 38th Legion was not able to interfere with the traitors' march on Terra. Lorgar intended to achieve this by two means, one military, the other far more esoteric. The military objective was to unfold during and after the Battle of Calth, once the Ultramarines' strength had been shattered by the surprise assault of the Word-Bearers' forces. In this, the warp cultists aligned to Lorgar played a support role, for the task of killing Legiones Astartes could only be performed with any true efficacy by other Astartes. The warp cultists' role in the Battle of Calth was to engage the mortal forces mustered on and about Calth, the native defense units, Imperial Army Line regiments, and the elite of the Solar Auxilia. They were used as cannon fodder by the word-bearers, hurled against 1,000 defensive positions in order to foul the defenders' guns, while the traitor Astartes closed to assault range to deliver the killing blow. They were then used to hunt down survivors of the initial betrayal and to harry any force that attempted to consolidate with other remnants, and were given responsibility for scouring the cities of Calth of their populations, driving the populace from the shelter of the dense cities and into the killing fields directly under the guns of the word-bearers' planetary bombardment fleet. As much as these tasks represented a military objective, they each served a still greater end which not even the genius of Robert Guilliman could foresee. The deaths inflicted by and upon the numerous warp cults aligned to the word-bearers were all enacted as part of Lorgar's great ritual to bring about the Ruin Storm, a vast warp storm similar to the later Great Rift that was to reave its way across the stars and slice the Imperium apart. Every drop of blood shed by the warp cults, whether that blood was their own or their enemies', served to attract the attentions of the ruinous powers. Each scream resounded in the Imperium and added yet another note in the great symphony of chaos which only Lorgar could perceive and direct. That symphony was building to a crescendo that was to break many solar months later at New Syria during the climax of the Shadow Crusade. Though it might appear that the word-bearers' allied warp cults were brutally exploited in the pursuit of Lorgar's grand scheme, the truth must be that they were entirely willing participants in their own demise. The cultists had been promised all manner of esoteric and visceral rewards in return for their lives. These religious fanatics willingly threw themselves onto the enemy's guns, in the process achieving the multiple goals of soaking enemy fire, blocking shots aimed at their Legiones Astartes masters, and of proving themselves worthy of the rewards promised to them. They did so with evident fervor, shrieks of blasphemous ecstasy on their bloody lips even as they fell, a pattern of behavior still seen in the present day among Chaos cultists. A further, still more awful use which the word-bearers' cultic allies were put to was only suspected at the time and was uncovered in more detail during the long years of the Calth Underworld War. The cultists were used as sacrificial offerings to the ruinous powers, willingly setting their necks upon sacrificial blocks or shedding their guts upon stone altars as part of the most hideous and debased chaos rituals imaginable. The objectives of these rituals varied, and while some were component parts of the larger ritual to bring the Ruin Storm into being, others were intended to summon warp entities, only later named demons in common Imperial parlance, from the other dimension of the warp. The more ritual form the deaths took, the more powerful or more numerous the entities summoned, so that for a time at least, the raw stuff of reality became stretched and worn at Calth as the things brought forth by the word-bearers fell upon their mortal prey in an orgy of blood. Oftentimes, those cultists not slain during the summoning of the warp entities were butchered by them soon afterwards, serving as the sustenance the creatures required to remain in the material dimension and fuel the planet-wide slaughter to come. Heresy, false belief, political corruption, the danger of religious schism, treachery, apostasy, rebellion, and disorder are all utterly corrosive to the unflinching order that sustains human interstellar civilization. Unity of purpose is needed if the Imperium, indeed humanity, is to survive in such a hostile universe. Since the dark days of the Age of Apostasy, it has been the sacred task of the Ordo Hereticus of the Inquisition to sustain that order by any means necessary. The foes of that order are diverse and widespread, from the false Adeptus Ministorum priest to the dissolute noblemen, demagogues, and seditionists of every stripe, the mutant skulking in the shadows, and those who would sell out humanity to the alien or worse. But of all its enemies, it is witches and rogue psychers that are the Ordo Hereticus's prime targets, and their pursuit, suppression, and destruction its most fervent goal. For any psyker who escapes discovery or flees from his just fate as part of the Black Ship's tithe, the Witch Hunter's pyre awaits. The business of the Ordo Hereticus is largely centered on the discovery and destruction of heretical or otherwise illegal cults and groups. The usage of the term cult within the Inquisition, and the wider Imperium for that matter, is a general one used to encompass the bewildering variety of possible religious sects, secret societies, creeds, political parties, associations, guilds, and conspiracies that are commonplace in the Imperium's many cultures. Outside what might be termed the two great religious cults of the Imperium, the Imperial Creed and the Adeptus Mechanicus, many other cults exist. The most common take the form of sects of the imperial state-sanctioned faith who devote themselves to a particular aspect of doctrine or the veneration of a particular imperial saint or miraculous event. Second to these are warrior societies of various forms, which are especially prevalent on feral or feudal worlds, followed closely by the numerous cult-like groups, most often preferring the term guild, who cater to a particular specialized craft or trade. Beyond these, most imperial worlds often boast scores of other local cults, whose exact nature often baffles outside scrutiny, tied to some idiosyncrasy of culture, planet, clan, or historical event. It is only when a group becomes considered heretical and is judged to espouse an ideology that is contrary to the Imperium's law or broad strictures of the Imperial Creed that a cult merits the Holy Ordos's attentions. Heresy can be a contagious thing in itself, and when it spreads, a cult is often formed from those that subscribe to it. In other cases, a powerful or charismatic leader will often draw a coterie of devoted disciples and followers into forming a heretical cult, and by the same token, deviants and like-minded individuals often join together for mutual support and protection. Cults exist in the main for very good reasons, the most obvious being secrecy. The protection and greater resources of the larger group allows it to better organize and conceal itself from prying eyes, rivals, and outside threats. The second is power, as the strength of a cult's membership united is often far greater than what an individual would possess. This is a truth that remains constant on many levels, from pooled finances to sustaining and reinforcing the loyalty and adherence of its members. Isolation, after all, promotes cohesion in and of itself, whilst division will destroy a cult as easily as any witch hunter's purge. Heretical cults often share several common attributes despite their many differences. Most seek to conceal themselves behind the disguise of a more benign, or at least accepted, front organization, or remain completely hidden from the authorities in order to avoid discovery. Cults also often favor a particular milieu in which to operate and recruit fresh members, which is often determined by the cult's own nature. For example, a cult centered on fermenting rebellion amongst mutant laborers will confine itself to the shatters and barrens where the mutants dwell, recruiting from the disaffected and outcasts among their numbers. Meanwhile, a malefic conspiracy of demon worship among the depraved imperial planetary nobility will often limit itself to the salons and private estates of the elite for its haunts and recruiting grounds. Many cults also share similar organizational structures despite their differing goals and natures, the most common of which are detailed below. Each has its own strengths and weaknesses, and in many cases the structure may involve many minor differences in practice and effect. While a particular cult may favor one structure over another, it will often include other structural elements as well. It is no coincidence that many of the lowly followers of chaos are mentally unstable, social misfits, or else desperate individuals whose only hope of sanctuary lies in the bosom of chaos. Among these are people who believe that all mankind is doomed, and that they live in the last days of man's dominion before the universe is swallowed by chaos. These people are called Apocalypts, and their particular brand of insanity inspires them to fight against all government order to bring about the collapse of civilization which they believe inevitable. while war bands of Heretic Astartes and Traitoris Militarum practice their worship of the Lord of Skulls openly. Mortal cultists gather in backrooms and secret slaughter tunnels beneath crowded streets, plotting murder and bloodshed in Khorne's name. Given the terrible nature of many Imperial worlds, however, locals often barely notice the increases in violent crimes, missing persons, and gory dismemberments, allowing blood cults of Khorne to flourish below the rot of Imperial society. The members of these cults have many different reasons for joining together. Some have seen a friend die in a bar fight. Others have lost their families in Adeptus Arbites raids or riot suppression actions. There are even those who fight for sport because they enjoy the feeling of fists shattering jawbones. All these reasons and more can set a man or woman on the path toward the veneration of Khorne. Vengeance and combat are intoxicating to those predisposed to revel in them. This feeling drives individuals to want more, to be strong enough to topple greater foes and to seek the power necessary to do so. No matter the reason that brings them together, when these individuals find each other, they are united by a common desire. They wish to kill, offering blood and skulls in exchange for power and retribution, and Khorne has much to offer them in the bargain. Perhaps the most efficient structure for a cult carrying out activities that risk regular exposure and persecution is the cellular structure. This kind of cult structure breaks down its membership into a series of small subgroups, the cult cells. Cells, which range from a handful of individuals up to perhaps hundreds of members, are each devoted to carrying out a particular specialization or a certain task or goal. Other than the select few or an individual who control the cell, none of the cell's other members has any direct contact with the wider cult or even other cultists outside of his immediate circle and cell. This structure has the profound advantage that if any of its rank and file are captured or compromised, they may betray nothing that does not concern their own immediate cell, keeping the wider cult safe and its dealings and purposes secret. Indeed, this shell game may be carried further, with a particular cell's leadership forming the rank and file of another, smaller cell senior in authority, and that cell's leadership part of another, and so on. This can prove a phenomenally hard structure to successfully track and destroy, and by its nature is highly adept at covert and independent operations. Many of the most dangerous cults and heretical groups who are sufficiently well organized operate a cell structure, or at least organize their field agents into cells for this reason, as does, ironically enough, the Inquisition. Charismatic cults are the simplest in structure, as their organization is based around the authority of a single figure, the cult's leader. Personal authority is usually the norm in these cults and is maintained by the leader's force of character, natural charisma, oratory skills, or simple personal power. Cults led by a single powerful figure such as a witch or magus are often of this type, although any place where malcontent or religious schism breeds can throw up a charismatic leader. This individual will exploit the weakness of others for their own personal power or gratification, or the fulfillment of their own apocalyptic vision. Individuals who exhibit great cunning, intelligence, and ambition, particularly those who came into power through convoluted schemes, have a part to play in the great drama of the playwright of destiny. As Tzeentch and its minions prefer to wage war through deception, guile, espionage, and trickery rather than open warfare, the Master of Fate places high value on mortals in positions of power who can influence organizations, gain access to classified information, direct the allocation of resources, and shape decisions and policy. The Great Conspirator does not discriminate, nor does it recruit only from the social and intellectual elite. Tzeentch also prizes those cunning and ruthless low-born individuals who must lie, cheat, steal, and deceive simply to survive. Anyone with the right combination of strengths and attributes might catch Tzeentch's attention. Death and blood underpin human existence. It is a common truism that only through continued blood sacrifice in the face of a hostile universe will mankind prevail, a sacrifice likened in the Imperial Creed to the bodily sacrifice of the Emperor himself. So it is in these beliefs that death cults flourish within the Imperium, a dark shadow of the more readily recognized sects of the imperial faith, making them some of the most dangerous heretical cults that the Inquisition can encounter. Some are no doubt deluded, corrupted by the ruinous powers, or swayed by far older and more terrible influences, but many are devout followers of the throne. To these individuals, every death, every cut, every welling of blood is an act of worship to the immortal emperor of mankind. Such death cults can vary widely in purpose, creed, makeup, and scope, but even the least suspect walks something of a tightrope between the sublime and the damned. Perhaps the most commonplace and famed subdivision of the death cults, sanguinary cults focus on the act of bloodshed itself, the manifold art of killing and the moment of extinction. Often honing the skills of the assassin beyond the ken of normal men, such cults are tolerated or at least willfully ignored by the imperial authorities, despite their heretical and even vampiric tendencies. This tolerance is because they are known to be implacable in their hatred of mankind's enemies, supplying the Adeptus Ministorum and the Inquisition with invaluable adepts of murder and fanatical killers loyal to the cause. Some have even more shadowy connections to the mysterious Officio Assassinorum, the secret organization that provides unparalleled adepts of murder for the High Lords of Terra. Many sanguinary cults spring into being in the fertile soil provided by the harsh conditions found on many feral and feudal worlds. However, the shadows of the Underhive, the viperous intrigues of the noble's court, and even the travails of deep space can equally create the conditions where ritual societies dedicated to the deadly arts of the blade, bullet, and poison can flourish. The Calixis sector has numerous such sanguinary cults and sacrificial societies present scattered across many worlds, and indeed the population of the outcast feudal world of Furvius is largely governed by them. The most famous of the death cultists, without doubt, are the assassin mystics of the Moritat, which has subcults and cells operating right across the sector and indeed beyond. Necrophagic cults are the most blatantly heretical and terrible of all death cults, with sects often springing up on worlds ravaged by incessant warfare or planet-wide famine, pandemic disease, or other terrible disasters. In desperation and often goaded by outside influence, the people's faith and devotion take on an increasingly malign turn, with human sacrifice, cannibalism, and necrotic rituals becoming widespread. In such cases, the members of these cults rapidly become irretrievably insane and physically corrupt, and are often the playthings of warp entities, while the vile leaders of such cults walk a tightrope between burgeoning malefic power and utter madness. Necrophagic cults are never tolerated by the imperial authorities and are hounded to destruction wherever uncovered. Within the Calixis sector, necrophagic cults have been known to spring up in the wake of long-burning wars, as has happened on Tranche and Malice in recent years, on isolated and savage worlds such as Endrite, and in the dark space hulks and vessels in space where stricken survivors or desperate stowaways devolve into a form of mutant cannibal known to the Voidborn as Gillam or Holdgaunts. But of all these tales, none can compare to the ancient stories of the appalling Sene clan of Dusk, whose half-mythic ghoulish histories have given the children of the Calixis sector nightmares for many Terran centuries. Rarely encountered but insidious in nature, Resurrectionist cults ultimately seek to conquer the secrets of life and death itself. Some Resurrectionist cults preach a doctrine of the Emperor's triumph over death and the conquest of human weakness, while others entreat darker masters, pursue utterly forbidden sciences, or hide baleful xenos or warp-spawned influences at their hearts. Often they espouse the goal of attaining physical immortality for the faithful and will go to unspeakable lengths to obtain their ends. More so than even the sanguinary cults, these groups attract insane and desperate individuals to their ranks, those who have lost everything, become the most degenerate heretics, or follow the wildest of deviant creeds. Some resurrectionists even practice ritual revivification to indoctrinate their members. The most extreme examples of such sects believe that the Emperor's plan is for mankind to follow him into a blessed immortality of the flesh. They even claim that it is possible through the use of utterly forbidden archaeotech to free the Emperor from the Golden Throne to walk among his people, dead but alive everlasting, to quote the darkly renowned Credo Mortifex. Such cults are hated by both the Ministorum and the Adeptus Mechanicus and must throw up a murderous veil of secrecy and superstition in order to survive. Not all who seek to serve Nurgle have the means to attract the Plague God's attention through grand individual acts of devotion. Most mortals do not have the might of a Chaos Space Marine or the influence of a corrupt political leader. For these common worshippers, notice is often best gained when they band together as a plague cult. The power of such a group is far greater than that of any one of its members. Alone, these individuals can do very little, but if all are members of the same plague cult, it can be another matter entirely. The guard can look the other way when suspicious materials are smuggled in and stored safely away from prying eyes. Disease and despair are common throughout the galaxy. Death is ever present as well, especially when plague grips a region. Some who would worship Nurgle see the death that follows disease, misinterpret the Plague Lord's will, and form death cults instead of plague cults. To these woeful souls, death is all. They believe that Nurgle's ultimate goal is final death. They are wrong. One common task that plague cults often take upon themselves is the eradication of these rival death cults who have so egregiously wronged Nurgle. The struggles between the two types of cults are usually limited to small skirmishes or individual assassinations. Only when it is too late, when the plague cult has vanquished the heretics and an unstoppable contagion spreads through their streets, do the authorities realize their error. There are countless ways to come to know the glory of Slaanesh. Some mortals are simply tired of the suffering they experience daily in a merciless, unrelenting galaxy and want some sort of reward for enduring the ceaseless pain. Others enjoy a life of privilege already, but refuse to be satisfied with what they have. There are even those who simply cannot seem to resist certain actions or sensations, from listening to screams of tormented captives in torture chambers, filling their bodies with neurostims, or obsessively staring at walls of a particular shade of mauve for solar hours on end. From the most grand ambitions to the most seemingly innocent desires, anything that causes the slightest pleasure in a mortal is a psychic opening through which the Dark Prince can make its presence and influence felt. Regardless of where a cult springs up, how it grows, or what the particular fixations it has might be, all pleasure cults of Slaanesh have common themes: excess, sensation, and personal perfection. One cult may be trying to find the perfect pitch at which to scream, another seeking the most efficient way to get wine into the bloodstream, and another pushing the limits of how much skin can be removed before the body fails. They are all looking for more than they have, or more than they have been told is possible. A cult of Slaanesh is a study in obsession, just as their Dark Prince would have it. Of the heaving masses that make up the citizenry of the Imperium, most live in desperate squalor, packed into mountainous hive cities where they toil endlessly in vast manufactoria. Generations upon generations live and die in a state of constant fear. Fear of invasion, fear of starvation, and fear of the retribution they will face if they dare to cast off the shackles of imperial order. These wretched conditions are the perfect breeding ground for dissent and rebellion. In the face of hopelessness, many are swayed by whispered stories that tell of the Chaos Gods and the rewards bestowed upon their followers. Such unimaginable power is tantalizing to the powerless and sets many on the path to damnation. Cults begin to grow deep within the fabric of imperial worlds, driven by the profane preachings of chaos-touched demagogues. Though many of these cults are found and eradicated by the Ordo Hereticus, the Watchers within the Imperium are not able to have eyes everywhere, and many more of these cults flourish. The Cultists hide in plain sight, their drab clothes covering heretical tattoos and symbols they have carved into their own flesh, dedicated to the ruinous powers. Their numbers continue to swell with time until the cult has infected large portions of the planet's society and a collective feeling of destiny gives the members purpose. They begin to gather weapons into secret caches, pilfering from planetary defense forces and crafting makeshift implements with which they can hack and bludgeon. Some are even given visions which reveal methods to piece together crude but effective guns. As their hour of reckoning approaches, the most faithful servants are marked with hideous mutations, and the wretches that behold these gifts offer up their souls willingly in worship to Tzeentch. At last, as the invading forces of the Thousand Sons Traitor Legion approach their world, the cultists' presence is unveiled. In a violent explosion of pent-up wrath, they fall upon those with whom they have lived their whole lives. None are spared from their twisted fury, and they carve great bloody swaths through the hab blocks and manufacturum districts, chanting blasphemies and paradoxical oaths as they rampage. Giant pyres are lit in the name of Tzeentch, and by their burning light the cultists continue to mangle and mutilate those still loyal to the Imperium. Many cities, even whole world, fall quickly to the sudden influx of cultists, their defenses completely overrun by the seemingly unending flood of bodies. But those that somehow are able to stem the tide of violence face an even greater threat as the thrall bands of the Thousand Sons begin their inexorable march. Inferno, bolter fire, and crackling beams of eldritch energy fly over the teeming throngs of cultists, while tanks and demon engines tear through ferrocrete walls to allow the stampede of tainted humanity to continue. The sheer volume of cultists allows them to soak up a vast amount of returned fire without losing momentum, and the sight of rubric marines and sorcerers on the battlefield sends them into a religious fervor. For these ornately armored Chaos Space Marines are like walking saints, come to bless the cultists for their loyal devotion. Whatever hope a cultist may have derived from their profane worship is inevitably false. They are but pawns in the plans of the Thousand Sons, meet to clog the wheels of the Imperial war machine. Should they live through their initial uprising, no great reward awaits them. Those who survive may be taken by the thrall bands to other war zones, where they will again be sent to die on the front lines. Others are transported to the planet of the sorcerers to serve as slaves or to be used as subjects in arcane experiments. Still more are simply overtaken by their own mutations and become gibbering chaos spawn. History has yet to relate the names of all of the cultic forces the Word-Bearers committed at the Battle of Calth, where chaos cultists were first used in large-scale military actions. And it is likely that, as the Underworld War ground on, those factions brought to Calth as part of the Calth conjunction that Horus ordered as a pretext to gather the Imperial forces at Calth altered greatly. Some were obliterated when the Ultramarines began their counterattack on the surface, while others merged, split, or changed in other ways. On the day of the Calth conjunction, however, there were 4 chief cultic groups represented amongst the ranks of the traitors, and it is likely there were numerous smaller factions present in addition to these, the names of most of which history does not record, and only substantive evidence for cult forces in the Northern Hemisphere remains. The 4 primary warp cults present at the Battle of Calth were the Ushmata Kaul, the Brotherhood of the Knife, the Tsenvar Kaul, the Recursive Kin, the Jaharwanata, the Ring, and the Mandari, the Gene Kin. The heavily mechanized forces of the Kalak war hosts that took part in the Battle of Ithaca on Calth's southern continent were notable in themselves as their trappings of technology and record of imperial military service masked the truth of their savage culture and devotion to the influence of the warp, and therefore do not conform to the pattern illustrated here. As such, they were not a cultic force in this accepted sense, but more like traitor regiments of the Imperial Army. Such histories that exist describing the roots of the Horus Heresy reserve a special place for the warrior lodges of the feral world of Davin. Such descriptions are beyond the scope of this account, and much remains unknown. But any examination of the warp cults of the ancient galactic civil war must also include some mention of the Davinite lodge priests, who were often to be found serving alongside them. These twisted abhuman magi and demagogues each followed one of the animist and totemic warrior and mystic cults of Davin. Of these, one of the most commonly encountered were initiates of the so-called Serpent Lodge, into whose clutches the War Master Horus fell when wounded on Davin's plague moon, and who would go on to act as his emissaries, but numerous other lodges were also recorded to a lesser extent. The warrior lodge priests appeared to serve a higher interest than the individual cults, and may have been acting in concert with certain conspirators at the highest levels of the traitors' leadership, in particular the Dark Apostles of the Word Bearers, who it is apparent had a hand in countless atrocities across thousands of worlds. While some lodge priests served as advisors in matters of prophecy and the warp, others acted as high priests under whom multiple cult bodies could be gathered together. All were schooled in the darkest arts of warpcraft and were able to call upon and wield the most terrible of warp-born powers and aberrant psyker abilities, making them one of the most dangerous classes of the War Master Horus's allies outside of the heretic Astartes of the traitor legions themselves. Of the recursive kin and the ring, very little is known save they were represented on the Calth muster tally as feral world levies dragged along in the wake of the Word Bearers' Legion. While both factions fought in the opening phases of the war and inflicted heavy losses on the loyalist defenders of Calth, both were largely wiped out by counterattacks when the Ultramarines regained control of Calth's planetary defense grid and initiated a heavy bombardment of traitor units from orbit. According to after-action reports, both forces were observed engaging in the most outlandish of rituals and employed warpcraft via rogue and aberrant psyker mutants concealed within their ranks. The Tsenva Kaul, in particular, numbered many thousands of abhumans and mutants in their ranks, ranking them as third-line troops, suitable only for hazardous environment labor, forlorn hope operations, and zone mortalis clearance duties. The conspiracy of the traitors had concealed the full extent of their physiological deviance, however, which proved to be far in excess of that which would have warranted extermination on the grounds of biological contamination to the Imperium. These forces, when unveiled in battle, were revealed to be so debased in body and mind. They were little more than caricatured mockeries of humanity whose limbs were twisted far beyond all human norms, sporting kitten horns, thrashing tentacle limbs, and far more eyes than any living thing should have. These aberrant creatures were simply driven at the Loyalists in massed wave assaults, seeking to overwhelm by sheer numbers, and died in their thousands either to Loyalist guns or the indiscriminate bombardments launched by their allies. The Brotherhood of the Knife was the largest and most effective of the warp cults deployed by the Word Bearers to Calth. As with others of its kind, it was brought to the muster under the guise of second-line Exertus Imperialis Levi Auxilia, with an entry given to the muster as classification Light Infantry Terrestrial Subtype / Feral Feudal Regressive. The cult force was, it appears, organized into between 10, 20 subsects, each at least 10,000 strong. The members of the Ushmatar Kaul had already gained something of a reputation as a most bloodthirsty and brutal fighting force alongside the Word Bearers during their later Imperial compliance actions of the Great Crusade, and they were recorded as engaging in the most violent rites before, after, and even during battle. The excesses attributed to these forces during the Battle of Calth, particularly by the harrowing accounts of civilian survivors, speak of the Brotherhood of the Knife fighting clad in rags, soaked with the freshly spilled blood of sacrificial victims, which were as likely to be drawn from their own ranks as from captured enemy combatants. Others had daubed arcane symbols on their skin with blood, or had hair matted with clotted viscera, the byproducts of mutilations and acts of furious cannibalism beyond the countenance of any sane mind. Many bore ceremonial blades and other melee weapons, and the more senior wielded ritual weapons since classified under the general term athame, fashioned of jagged stone or strangely alloyed iron. Such weapons were by unknown means specifically attuned to the realm of the warp, so that every death they inflicted was an offering to feed the imperial entities with which the cult was in communion, and by the act of killing, they sought to breach the barriers which separated the material realm from the immaterium. It is believed that the Ushmatar Kaul proved itself a key component in the vast ritual of which the death of Calth was but the opening phase. its thousand-strong cohorts being deployed into the many cities and provinces across the surface of Calth, from Numinous to Talanco. The Brotherhoods fought in close coordination with their word-bearers' masters, either serving as an expendable first wave or to clear entrenched foes by weight of numbers, butcher the wounded and round up prisoners for sacrifice. They were also fearsome and skilled fighters, and while individual cultists were no match for a space marine, they had the advantage of numbers and were driven by their twisted creed to perform deeds beyond the endurance of mortal soldiers. With each death inflicted by the Ushmatar Call, Lorgar's grand ritual to create the Ruin Storm was progressed an increment more, making the Brotherhood of the Knife as useful in an occult sense as it was in a military one. Perhaps the most unusual of the cultic sects engaged at the Battle of Calth were the Mandari, about which very little is known, for the manner of its members' devotions left little behind in the way of evidence that might be studied. What is known from examining captured fragments of their sacred texts from the bodies of the dead is that the rank and file of the Mandari, the so-called Gene-kin, were bound by some aberrant combination of technology and genetics to the service of the warp in such a way that they believed utterly they would be reborn immediately after their deaths into a new and glorious form. The word-bearers, it appears, promised the Mandari Gene-kin that they were in essence immortal. While a great many of the warp cults committed to the Battle of Calth and elsewhere likely held similar beliefs, those of the Mandari were far more than dogma or esoteric metaphor. Accounts submitted by Ultramarines units following the Battle of Calth and the subsequent Underworld War describe incidents of spontaneous mutation of a singular character far beyond the most extreme cases of bioaberration previously recorded by Imperial savants, up to and including the bodily revivification of the dead. Forensic examination of recovered corpses by the Thursday Legion's apothecaries obtained during the Underworld War also record numerous medical anomalies, such as unnecessary surgical interventions and seemingly non-functioning implantations of extraneous foreign matter. The process by which these individuals underwent change was far from certain, yet in time, the defenders of Calth came to recognize the hideous effect. Within a period of a few solar minutes to several solar hours after death, the body of the slain might begin to convulse and then thrash, bones snapping and flesh distending to the extent of acquiring additional mass by unknown means. Ruined flesh would re-knit, the fallen Mandari becoming a bent, split, and twisted thing, which bore little resemblance to the human form, and that moved across the ground in an entirely unnatural, rapid gait, and was impervious to pain and trauma. Killing the returned Mandari took bravery, discipline, and concentrated fire, and the defenders of Calth soon learned that only severe trauma inflicted to a Mandari cultist's central mass would ensure the horrific process did not occur. By their very nature and the fact that they could only be killed by the most destructive of means, the reanimated Kaul Mandari proved impossible to study. Throughout the wars of the Horus Heresy, cultic factions organized themselves in many different ways, which remain still largely incomprehensible to Imperial observers. It was only much later that the numerological and esoteric significance of certain patterns and formulae were apprehended and categorized in the broadest terms by the agents of the Imperium's own more esoteric agencies, such as the Inquisition. Countless variation was observed, and any concerted effort to quantify or categorize cult formations was invariably doomed to failure. Despite this, certain common factors were observed across a wide range of cults, and while there were always examples of bodies with unique structures or no structure at all, some degree of commonality was recognized. The task of studying these groups was entrusted to a small number of savants and logistae on the staff of Malcador the Sigillite, the regent of Terra. While most of the work was carried out in secure isolation deep within the labyrinthine bowels of the Imperial Palace on Terra by adepts sifting through countless thousands of reports and accounts, some came about through first-hand observation by field adepts operating at great danger to themselves. It is from a combination of these two sources that the information presented here was collated. The majority of warp cultic groups were organized in a broadly pyramidal form, with a single individual at the apex and other members occupying subsidiary interstitial nodes with varying degrees of power and responsibility below them. Invariably, this person was either highly charismatic or otherwise able to exert an inordinate degree of control over the cult's members. In some cases, the leaders were possessed of psychic ability, either recently developed or else repressed for many Terran years before being revealed. Others were possessed of such darkly portentous and forbidden knowledge. They were able to bend the multitudes to their will with words and phrases that struck horror into the souls of all who heard them. Prior to the revelation of the War Master Horus's betrayal of the Emperor, the cult leader, or Magister, was the only member of the group who was aware of the existence of other cults, and invariably this individual kept such knowledge to themselves, apportioning small amounts out to underlings as rewards for service. In most cases, and in particular during the early days of the Horus Heresy, the leader was the only member of the warp cult with any contact with outside powers, namely the traitor legions or their agents, or indeed other cults. The Magister was master of the cult's numerous ciphers and secret tongues, without which both internal and external communications were all but impossible. This perspective invested cult leaders with enormous power and made it less likely they would be challenged or usurped, for in doing so any challenger would win only incomplete control of the group. Below the Magister, there often existed an inner circle, sometimes referred to as a coven, of especially trusted lieutenants, co-conspirators, seers, enforcers, advisors, consorts, bodyguards, and even family members, forming a malignant dynasty at the warp cult's heart. Such acolytes shared some of the leader's burden of command and assisted in the occult rituals and murderous pursuits around which the warp cult's activities were focused. When the call to rise up and fight for the War Master came, the individual members of the coven might serve as sub-officers, leading the greater masses of the cult into battle against the hated loyalists. The realities of war very quickly weeded out those not suited to battlefield service, and those who survived were often potent warrior leaders indeed. The greater mass of a warp cult was made up of seemingly normal people, subjects of the Emperor and citizens of the Imperium, who, despite appearances, nurtured a deep and twisted hatred for all the Great Crusade had achieved. When called upon to turn their hand against their masters, the masses did so with cruel relish. The majority of the cult's members had only the most rudimentary knowledge of tactics and weapons, but made up for this deficiency in wanton savagery, suicidal fervor, and deluded courage. Under the fell influence of the Magister and the cult's inner circle, the rank-and-file cultists would obey any order and perform any deed, utterly certain that even should they die, they would be resurrected into a new and supremely powerful sphere of existence as just reward for their sacrifice. As with other tiers, those cultists not suited to warfare were cut down in the opening salvos, leaving behind a core of warriors that in sufficient numbers could overwhelm almost any foe. Warp cults had two primary weapons to bring to bear against the Loyalists. The first was simple numerical advantage, for the tendrils of heresy had spread far and wide in the years preceding the betrayals in the Istvan system, and by the time of the Battle of Calth, the traitors were able to call upon unnumbered hordes of devoted cultist foot soldiers. Numbering among the subservient foot soldiers loyal to the word-bearers and sons of Horus in particular, traitor war fleets were often accompanied by carrier vessels whose dark, stifling cargo holds were crammed full of cultists devoted to their cause. While many warp cults rose up as discrete bodies, each holding their own idiosyncratic beliefs and practices, once swept up in the massive sector-wide advances of the Horus Heresy, they were soon subsumed into a gestalt mass of frenzied chaos devotees bearing all manner of equipment and clothing. The second is that numbers alone are unlikely to have granted these forces a decisive advantage, and it was in the sphere of the esoteric and the occult that their true strength was to be found. At Calth and in many other conflicts, the warp cults served as part of a grand conspiracy, one in which stratagems beyond the grasp of the Loyalists were frequently employed. By way of warpcraft and forbidden psionics, warp magi could cause the Imperium to bleed into reality. They could assail the foe with the sanity-shattering wails of damned souls. They could make the stars go out and cause horrifying visions to burn across the night skies. Most terrible and potent of all were those magi who, by way of pacts with the unnameable denizens of the beyond, could call forth legions of fiends, things dubbed demon by those few who witnessed them and survived to recount the nightmare. Time after time, the warp cults showed themselves willing to sacrifice their own lives in abominable mass sacrificial rituals to bring these creatures into being on the material plane, and the loyalists learned at a high price indeed that in slaying the massed hordes of warp cultists, they might simply be hastening the arrival of a second wave of warp-born demons, a foe which few mortals and only the most stoic of the Legiones Astartes could hope to defeat. In the panoply of war, however, the majority of warp cults were almost entirely deficient. Unlike the Imperialis Auxilia regiments that declared for Horus, the countless warp cults rarely had any access to military stockpiles before they rose up against the Imperium. Even once counted amongst the ranks of the traitors, most cult bodies were afforded only the most limited access to traitor supply chains. In reality, most cultists armed and equipped themselves by looting the bodies of the fallen, both traitor and loyalist, giving them a motley and ramshackle appearance made all the more outlandish by the occult formulae and warp-based heretical runes scratched into weapons and daubed across flesh and armor. For all their undoubted value to the traitor Legiones Astartes, the fate of the majority of allied warp cults was the same on many battlefields. Their lot was to be expended as ammunition in the service of the War Master. They were frequently deployed but rarely redeployed unless they could extract themselves from a war zone by their own efforts. Traitor Legiones Astartes commanders gave little or no heed to cultists' well-being and regarded them as entirely expendable. Until the Siege of Terra, this fact was never made more starkly clear than at Calth, where hundreds of thousands of deluded warp cultists were committed, only to be abandoned, their deaths but one element in Lorgar's far-reaching and unfathomable ritual to bring about the ruin storm. The Admonition, also known as the Cult of Admonition, is a chaos cult dedicated to Nurgle, the chaos god of disease and despair, that exists within the lower and middle reaches of Hive Tertium, the primary hive city of Adama Prime, the capital world of the Moebian domain of the Imperium. The word admonition means a firm, authoritative, or harsh warning, reprimand, rebuke, or counsel. What could this warning or counsel be that the cult offers to the people of Adama Prime? The majority of the heretics of the cult encountered by Imperial forces spout some line mentioning truth. This truth is likely what the cultists admonish the population to accept, the insane ideology of Nurgle, which basically calls upon mortals to embrace the inevitability of rot, decay, disease, and death in order to be freed by the plague lord of the fear and despair such outcomes produce. In the era Indomitus, the Admonition unleashed a zombie plague and the walking pox upon the hive city, and a swarm of zombies and poxwalkers soon began to assault the lower reaches of Hive Tertium. To deal with the undead threat, the elite Mobian 6th Regiment was redirected from frontline deployment in the Fringe War to assist in combating the Nurglish corruption. Instead, the chaos-corrupted Astra Militarum Regiment turned on the people it had sworn to protect and began to support the uprising as a Traitoris Militarum force dedicated to overthrowing imperial rule on Atoma Prime and spreading the dark truth of Nurgle and chaos to all its people. To stop this growing corruption, the Inquisition under the command of the Ordo Hereticus Inquisitor Grendel recently deployed its forces, including large groups of acolytes, into Hive Tertium in a race against time to save the Hive City before the cult's corruption can grow into a cancer that could consume the entire world, or even eventually threaten the entire Mobius domain. The Blood Pact is a chaos warband devoted to Khorne, differing from other such warbands in that they follow an unusually disciplined way of life. They can be found on the so-called sanguinary worlds of the Sabbat World sector, primarily around the world of Gura. Unlike many chaos cultist warbands, The Blood Pact fights as a disciplined army against the onslaught of the Astra Militarum's Sabbat Worlds Crusade, and this is what makes them so effective compared to the usual disorganized chaos masses. Consisting of highly trained vicious soldiers and Xenos mercenaries, the soldiers of the Blood Pact know no fear or hesitation. They have overrun entire worlds and caused the people of the Imperium no small amount of suffering and woe during the Sabbat Worlds Crusade. The Blood Pact's adherents, like their allies among the sons of SEK, possess an unusual view of chaos theology. They do not hate the Emperor as an enemy of chaos, but venerate him as another embodiment of the warp. They believe the Emperor to be simply another warp entity, like a demon or the chaos gods themselves. They see him as a misguided prophet for humanity who has seen the power of the warp, but who mislead his followers into believing that it should be opposed. The Blood Pact and their allies believe that it is the holy task of their cults to spread the truth about the God Emperor and the warp, and to bring the people of the Imperium back into the fold of worship of the powers of chaos, because in truth, they are already venerating a creature of the warp. For these cultists, the Emperor is already akin to the entities they worship, for he too is powered by the warp and has been changed by his contact with the Immaterium. For these cultists, the Emperor is actually a symbol of what they aspire to, as they wish to become one with the warp and be forever changed by this communion. Thus, in their belief system, the schism of mistaken faith embraced by the Imperium must be healed and humanity brought back into the embrace of chaos. They hold that the Imperium does not need to be destroyed, but only reformed so that it understands the true nature of the warp and its inhabitants. In this view, the Imperial Creed has led the people of the Imperium down the wrong path for millennia, and the Blood Pact and their allies believe that they are engaged in a war to defeat its gatekeepers so they can teach humanity the truth of the enlightenment that chaos offers, and that they have already been worshipping without realizing it. The inhabitants of Messia live in a world blighted with industrial pollution and utterly inhospitable to human life. Yet human life persists and has taken root within the twin cities at the planet's poles. Life in these cities is hard and heavily dependent on expeditions that continuously scour Messiah's blasted wastelands to secure precious promethium. Such expeditions are made up of the hardiest of Messiah's inhabitants, and it is from these that the Chem-Hunters arise. Chem-Hunters are veterans of the unforgiving wilderness of Messia and offer their invaluable services as raiders and escorts to the drill barons. They are consummate riders and skirmishers, frequently seen operating attack bike escorts or clinging to the rigs watching for roaming mutant hordes. The majority of Messiah's population view them as daredevils at best and suicidal at worst. However, there is no denying that they are accomplished survivalists and valued additions to any warband. The Chem-Hunters of Messia are skilled and deadly killers who are used to surviving in spite of desperate odds. They tend towards wild and reckless behavior, seeming to care little about the potential pitfalls of their actions. These nomads operate as mercenaries and guides that sell their services to the highest bidder, which on Messia usually means working for the notorious Prometheum drill barons. They are also proficient mechanics, most having to salvage and repair their vehicles under rather frantic circumstances. Despite the many extreme dangers, life on an expedition offers a great degree of freedom from the constant degradations of Messiah's cities. Chem-Hunters are constantly exposed to all manner of pollutants and toxins in the scorched wastelands, and should they survive, become naturally resistant to such chemicals. However, these individuals also suffer from a unique poisoning that makes them dependent on the very compounds that afflict their bodies. The exact nature of this toxin is unknown. Some, however, speculate that it may be related to the phenomenon that spawns the planet's roving mutant hordes. The Sons of SEK are an unusually regimented and disciplined chaos warband located in the Sanguinary Worlds, under the command of the Magister Anaquaner SEK, one of the Archon Urlach Gower's closest subordinates in the defense of the Sabbat Worlds sector from the assault of the Imperial Sabbat Worlds Crusade. While still relatively new to the war for the Sabbat Worlds, initial reports indicate that the Sons of SEK may, in fact, be superior in combat to their cousins in Urlach Gower's own Blood Pact. In addition to being of larger, stockier build, the Sons are also equipped with higher quality gear and weapons. The Sons are also better motivated and led, and even include an officer similar to an Imperial Commissar, known as a Scourger, to maintain discipline and morale. This is something that even the unusually disciplined Blood Pact lacks. The Sons of SEK were created not only to fight against the Imperium, but also to serve as Magister Sek's vanguard for when he eventually attempts to overthrow the Gower and assume the position of Archon over all the forces of chaos in the Sabbat World sector. The Sons of Sek's adherents, like their allies among the Blood Pact, possess an unusual view of chaos theology. They do not hate the Emperor as an enemy of chaos, but venerate him as another embodiment of the warp. They believe the Emperor to be simply another warp entity, like a demon or the chaos gods themselves. They see him as a misguided prophet for humanity who has seen the power of the warp, but who mislead his followers into believing that it should be opposed. The Blood Pact and their allies believe that it is the holy task of their cults to spread the truth about the God Emperor and the warp, and to bring the people of the Imperium back into the fold of worship of the powers of chaos, because in truth, they are already venerating a creature of the warp. For these cultists, the Emperor is already akin to the entities they worship, for he too is powered by the warp and has been changed by his contact with the Immaterium. For these cultists, the Emperor is actually a symbol of what they aspire to, as they wish to become one with the warp and be forever changed by this communion. Thus, in their belief system, the schism of mistaken faith embraced by the Imperium must be healed and humanity brought back into the embrace of chaos. They hold that the Imperium does not need to be destroyed, but only reformed so that it understands the true nature of the warp and its inhabitants. In this view, the Imperial Creed has led the people of the Imperium down the wrong path for millennia, and the Blood Pact and their allies believe that they are engaged in a war to defeat its gatekeepers so they can teach humanity the truth of the enlightenment that chaos offers, and that they have already been worshipping without realizing it.